ring. If you ready, let's go. Hey, casual wrestling community show. You already know.
What is up, everybody? Today I am going to piss the IWC off and create the perfect tier maker list of all the current wrestlers deserving of the Wrestling God title. Now, I've put together a list of 13 wrestlers from nationally televised companies, WWE, AEW, that I believe even deserve to kind of scratch the surface of the conversation of being a pro wrestling god. Keep in mind, this list is for active wrestlers only. This tier maker is available for anybody to fill out on their own. Just go to the link that is in the description of this video. And if you make your own version of this list, make sure to post it on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and tag me at Notorious Nerdy D on any social media network you're on. I want to see where we agree and where we disagree. So let's jump right in here. 13 current pro wrestlers from nationally televised wrestling programs. They meet my requirements to be considered for God status. Now, my criteria is simple. They either have to be the greatest wrestler at some point in time of their career, or they had to have a major impact on professional wrestling at some point in time. 13 names on the list. Got Becky Lynch, Brock Lesnar, Bryan Danielson, Charlotte Flair, CM Punk, Cody Rhodes, Edge, Jericho, Kenny Omega, Paul Heyman, Randy Orton, Roman Reigns, and Seth Rollins. So when we start this list, we have to set a baseline so that we can all kind of agree that we don't get overzealous here and just shove everybody into the God tier, because that's the easiest thing to do. And at some point in time, I'm probably going to mash everybody into one level anyway. But we have to set a baseline so we don't get overzealous here. Nobody goes to the God tier until I've kind of flushed out, I'd say, the Titans, Giants, and Mortals category. And with that, I'm immediately going to start off with, I'm going to skip Becky Lynch and I'm going to start with Brock Lesnar, because I think Brock is a good starting point to kind of gauge everybody else on the list by. And I'm immediately going to start off by taking Brock Lesnar and dropping him in to my Titans level of wrestling hierarchy here. So if we drop Brock Lesnar in there, now we can start back at the beginning with Becky Lynch. Becky Lynch is undoubtedly one of the most important women in pro wrestling, especially to WWE. She's a little bit self-made, kind of rose to the top on her own, grinded for the position she's in, still has a ton of upside, but is she on the level of Brock Lesnar? The simple answer to this is probably not, right? She's probably not on the level of Brock Lesnar. Is she a level below Brock Lesnar? I think for the time being, it's probably extremely safe to drop Becky Lynch into the Giants category and build our list around a baseline of, if a Titan is Brock Lesnar, a Giant is Becky Lynch. That moves us on to Bryan Danielson, right? And Bryan Danielson is possibly the greatest all-around professional wrestler there is in the business, especially in the modern times, right? Now, I don't know if I call him the greatest entertainer, but I do know that I from my point of view, he's the greatest wrestler right now. Possibly, if you culminate all the skills that Bryan Danielson has and you subtract out just his lack of natural size, he's great on a microphone, but he's not God tier on a microphone. It's hard to make an argument against not putting him right next to Brock Lesnar, right? And even possibly in the God tier. But to start off and to keep our baseline safe, we're gonna put Bryan Danielson, I think, as a Titan of pro wrestling at this point in time, and we'll make adjustments as we go. Now, Charlotte Flair, this is a little bit tougher for me because I've never really been a huge Charlotte Flair fan personally, but when you look at Charlotte Flair's resume on paper, man, it's the real deal, right? 6-time WWE Raw Women's Champion, 6-time Smackdown Women's Champion, WWE Divas Champion. Her lineage goes back to like the Divas belt, that's hard for me to fucking believe that she goes back that far. 2-time NXT Women's Champion, Grand Slam Champion, Triple Crown Champion, Women's Royal Rumble winner 2020, and she's got a WWE Year-End Award for Match of the Year in 2018. It is hard to argue against those numbers. I'm tempted right now to just slide Charlotte up to the God tier, close my laptop and walk off and let everybody argue about this. But for right now, I think it's probably safer to take Charlotte Flair and drop her into the Titans of Titan of pro wrestling. And like I said, we'll make adjustments as we go. Next up, we got CM Punk. And this is another kind of hard one for me to judge because at one point in my life, I was a huge CM Punk fan. And at his pinnacle of his like pipe bomb days, he was probably the biggest thing in pro wrestling and probably easily a god of pro wrestling based on just the mystique he created. And I know it's not fair when we take reality and take perception and we kind of intertwine them and take things that are outside of pro wrestling and bring them into pro wrestling. Seeing CM Punk get his ass beat in MMA, it took a little bit of that mystique away from me. And then having CM Punk leave WWE and claim he's never coming back to pro wrestling to then return to pro wrestling, while that's great for the company of AEW and that's great for pro wrestling fans in general, I think it kind of hurts the mystique that was CM Punk. I think he left on top of the mountain, and when he came back, he couldn't live up to that level of hype anymore. I'm elated to see happy CM Punk. I wish he was a heel, but I think he's happy doing his thing. Maybe he'll be a heel. Maybe he wins the title in the next week or two. And if he does, great. This list could be readjusted. But for the time being, this run in AEW has been a little bit sobering, I think, for people to see that we possibly missed out on the prime of CM Punk's career. Whatever that was to be, right? Were we duped in his just the anger and disdain he had for WWE? Did that make him more likable? Or was he really kind of on this elevated platform and he jumped off the boat while he was at the top of what he was doing? If this was 2011, he goes easily into my Titans, probably into my gods of wrestling. But since it's 2022, I think I have to play CM Punk. Right now, I think he's just a giant in pro wrestling. So that leads me to Cody Rhodes, right? So, and this is one you could argue maybe that Cody Rhodes doesn't belong on a list of gods of pro wrestling. What has Cody done to be a god of pro wrestling? And what I would argue is Cody is the instrumental reason that we have AEW today. And without AEW is the reason that the WWE has had to step up its game to another level and kind of return to not the Attitude Era. I get it. Like, slow down. I'm not saying that. But they've definitely elevated their game, and WrestleMania this year was definitely, it felt a little bit old school. Like, things are starting to pick up. It's starting to, if you're a WWE fan and you can get past the fact that this will never be the Attitude Era, like, things are starting to pick up around WWE, and I think we can give Cody Rhodes some credit for that. His indie runs, where he made his list of like wrestlers he wanted to wrestle, combined with his AEW run, where he was a world champion, set his ass on fire, and then combine that with the trajectory that he's actually on right now in WWE, where he's, the number 2 guy in the company, it feels like. I'm not considering Cody Rhodes to be a god of wrestling. I understand he's not a god of wrestling. But I think just out of respect, you have to put him on at least the fringe. He has to be in the conversation. He's not even knocking at the door. He's the guy standing on the sidewalk looking in, but he's at the party. He has the ability to get there. And I think this next run in WWE will determine a lot on where he ends up going. So then we move to someone like Edge, right? And I asked the question a couple months ago, is Edge a top 20 wrestler of all time? And I'm going to do a future video, where I defend the fact that I do think Edge is a top 20 wrestler of all time. I can make that argument. He wins in so many categories that we don't regularly think about, or we don't regularly assess greatness from. And one of those is longevity. He debuted on television in 1998. That's so fucking long ago. And his resume it's just wild to look at. Feud of the decade. He was feud of the decade with John Cena. Feud of the year in 2004 with Lita and Jeff Hardy. Match of the year in 2000, triangle ladder match, Hardys and Dudleys. Number 2 PWI in 2007. 4-time WWE champion. 7-time world heavyweight champion. 5-time Intercontinental Champion, 12-time Tag Team Champion, King of the Ring winner 2001, Money in the Bank 2005, Royal Rumble winner 2010 and 2021, and he's already in the WWE Hall of Fame. It's tough to argue with that resume. When you start making a list of greatest of all time, that's a tough resume to argue with. And I get there's an injury gap in there. from like 2011 to 2020 where we could go, what if? What would have been if Edge would have continued wrestling? But I think when you look at that, you have to you have to place Edge, and I put Cody there at Mortals, but you have to put Edge as a titan of pro wrestling. All right, so next we talk about Chris Jericho, and I joke around a ton when I talk about Chris Jericho on my podcast all the time. I do like genuinely believe that Chris Jericho is the greatest of all time. That's my position. And there's wrestlers, there's wrestlers who have done it bigger and better for short spurts of time, but nobody has reinvented themselves more than Chris Jericho, and nobody has been more integral to like the big three companies, to WCW, WWE, and AEW. And while you can make the argument that like there is no AEW without Cody Rhodes, you also have to make the argument that Chris Jericho was the lifeblood of AEW, and he kept it floating in its first year. Without Chris Jericho the first year, AEW sinks and it never gets off the ground. Chris Jericho put eyes on people like Kenny Omega. Chris Jericho put eyes on the Young Bucks. I don't need to read a resume here. I'm clearly a WWE guy, and I can't say enough good things about Jericho, even though he left the company, even though he is the rival company's kind of backbone, right? And if Brock Lesnar is the baseline as a Titan, then I think you have to take Chris Jericho and immediately make him a god of pro wrestling. I think that's where Chris Jericho has to be. When you set this baseline and you set what the standard is to be a god in pro wrestling, I think you have to look at Chris Jericho. Now, after Chris Jericho, we have to move into somebody here on the list, Kenny, the best bout machine Omega. And I'll be the first. Admittingly, I have very little watch time with Kenny Omega, right? I've seen his runs in AEW. I've watched a few YouTube videos of the best of Kenny Omega, which I'm sure don't do him justice, right? And I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to do his career any justice in this video, but I also do hear the reaction from fans and people in the IWC who tell me how great Kenny Omega is. And this is probably peer pressure where I put him on this list right now, because I'm not a fan of New Japan Pro Wrestling. I don't hold those accolades in the same regards as WWE titles and WWE accomplishments, or even AEW accomplishments. And right now, AEW is in its infancy, so nobody, he's held the belt one time, so nobody's going to have this long list of AEW accomplishments. But the reality is he doesn't have any WWE accomplishments to speak of. And I get there's companies that exist outside of WWE. I choose not to hold much stock in those companies, but probably just based on pure pressure alone, I'm going to put Kenny Omega as a titan of pro wrestling, kind of begrudgingly right now. And then as we balance out this list, I'll see, I kind of see where I feel that he gets to go. So next up is Paul Heyman. And Paul Heyman is only on this list because when I went to WWE.com to make this list, Paul Heyman, he appears on the roster as a WWE superstar. He's on the list. He gets to go on the gods list, right? And so I don't think there's much discussion here when you talk about Paul Heyman. To me, in my lifespan of watching pro wrestling, he is the best manager I have ever witnessed. He is the person that invokes the most emotion for me. So I'm not listing accolades of Paul Heyman. I'm not listing ECW and the things he's done. I'm purely just going that Paul Heyman is, by all standards, he is a god in wrestling. Now, Randy Orton feels a lot like Edge to me. His resume looks a lot like Edge to me. There's so much lineage and so much history. You have the Legend Killer, right? You have RK Bro. You have Legacy. You have Evolution. I think he was even at one point part of the Wyatt family for a minute. Look at the resume, man. 10-time WWE champion, 4-time heavyweight champion, 1-time IC, 1-time US. I know he's at least 3-time tag team champion, 2 times with Riddle, and I think 1 time with Edge, which is kind of fitting there. Money in the Bank in 2013, and Royal Rumble winner in 2009 and 2017. My only argument that I can make against Randy Orton is that at points in time, he's had some lulls in his career where he kind of fades into the background and becomes like slightly forgettable. But just out of instinct, looking at this list, I think you have to, if Kenny Omega is going to be a Titan, I think you have to put Randy Orton as a Titan as well. And I know that the Titans, it's getting a little messy in the Titan area. But then we got to move to the big dog. We got to move to Roman Reigns. Roman Reigns, right? The Mr. Controversy, Mr. Controversial. People love him, people hate him. The second coming of John Cena. Is he a wrestler? Is he a sports entertainer? All stupid questions, right? He's a wrestler. He does it well. He's good at what he does. Paul Heyman's out here running his mouth talking about, is he the greatest heel of this generation? Is the Bloodline the greatest faction ever? Look, I get Paul Heyman's got to say these things. He's got to. Paul Heyman's the marketing machine that keeps the Bloodline moving. But these are all buzz questions created by WWE just to hype a guy up who, when you start looking at the paper, man, his resume is not overly impressive. 4-time heavyweight champion, 2-time Universal champion, 1-time IC and US champion, 1-time tag team champion. He's got a Royal Rumble under his belt, and he's the longest running Universal champion, which is impressive, but not a long lineage there. And that's kind of it with Roman, right? And he's kind of talking about he's winding it down at this point. The resume, I get it doesn't tell the whole story, but it does tell a big chunk of the story. And I think that Roman is the biggest thing in pro wrestling right now. I get it, but he's talking about disappearing. And so when you're 1 foot out the door, I don't know that you're a god of pro wrestling. I think Roman's going to go try out Hollywood, and maybe hopefully he comes back, because I don't foresee Hollywood working out for Mr. Roman Reigns, but we have to be realistic on this list. And Roman, he's equivalent to Brock Lesnar in my eyes. And when I really start looking at this list again, I don't know that Brock Lesnar's a titan of pro wrestling. Like, when I really start looking at this list and it's coming together, I think you have to take Brock Lesnar and drop him down to a giant of pro wrestling. And that hurts. I know, but everybody can't be a titan. Everybody can't be a god. And I think if Brock Lesnar's a giant in pro wrestling, I think Roman's got to be a giant in pro wrestling. And that hurts me, because I think deep down inside, I believed that Roman Reigns was possibly a god in pro wrestling. Now we've got Seth being last here is pretty fitting. Seth is the last one to go, because I think once you start looking at the rest of the list, it's fairly simple to slide Seth Rollins in on this list. He's somewhere, I honestly believe, between a giant and a mortal. But if you have to put Seth Rollins on this list somewhere, I think you're putting Seth, you're putting him right next to Cody. I think that's where he goes. He's accomplished a lot, but he doesn't stick out in the same, his resume doesn't add up to some of those titans in wrestling. So I look at the list now. I've cleared the board, and I look at my list, and it's a little bit muddy in the middle. I think the Titans and Giants, they're a little bit muddy, because I do think now, looking back with a couple moves I made, there's a few people that look a little more disparaging, and they kind of stick out, right? And it kind of looks like there's an imposter in some of the clubs. And if I look at Giants just right off the bat, I don't think Becky can stay on that list. To be real honest, I think Becky has to move down to a mortal. I think that if you go Cody, Seth, and Becky on that fourth tier, that fourth rung of pro wrestling, I think that's pretty safe that where those people belong. All right, so when I look at the Titans, then we've got Bryan, Charlotte, Edge, Kenny Omega, and Randy Orton. And I know this is going to kill, IWC is going to fucking come for my head, but I just can't, I don't think Kenny Omega belongs in that list. I really think Kenny Omega is on Roman Reigns level. That's kind of that's the tier where he is. And I know there's going to be Kenny Omega's better than Roman. Roman's better than Kenny. Y'all can have that argument in the Giants. They're the Giants of wrestling. Their resumes, people have built them up to be bigger than what their actual resumes are. And I know Kenny Omega, the argument's going to be, but he's done so much outside of the wrestling that's on TV. I don't give a fuck, because what I watch is the wrestling on TV. And to me, that is the big part of wrestling, right? And so, man, I am so tempted to add another row in between gods and titans, because I just want to call it like god-light wrestlers. There's a couple people on this list that I go, I want to move them up to gods, but gods, it's an elite club, and unless you really have the resume to back it up, I don't know that you can just move somebody there. And I have a hard time not calling Charlotte Flair the greatest women's wrestler of all time. And that's hard for me to say, but I really think she is when you look at the resume. And I think she even solidified that more at Backlash this last month with her match against Ronda, where that, to me, that was possibly one of the best women's matches I've ever seen with my own eyes. I get you, everybody's got their opinion. Perspective is just from the person who's looking at it. But from my perspective, that was one of the best. That's kind of the benchmark of what I want women's wrestling to be. So when I look at this and I look at Charlotte's resume, as the greatest woman wrestler of all time, or at least in modern day, I think she's got to be a god, a goddess, whatever you want to call it. I think she's really got to be put into that category. And then that leaves me with Bryan Danielson. And Bryan is the one on this list that bothers me the most, right? And I'm so unsure of where I should put Bryan. On one hand, this is a God's list, right? These are the immortals, the people who've transcended every aspect of pro wrestling. And he had the yes movement, and his talent is literally unmatched. But there's a side of me that says Bryan has underachieved in mainstream wrestling. He hasn't won the AEW championship yet. And I get it, like, short career in AEW. He hasn't been there a long time, but he hasn't done it yet. And I think that's the stepping stone that he needs to actually just be pushed up into that God's category. So for the time being, I just can't do it. When you examine Bryan Danielson's resume from the national televised TV company's perspective, 4-time WWE champion, 1-time world heavyweight champion, 1-time IC and US, 2-time tag team, Money in the Bank 2011. I get the Ring of Honor stuff. I get the Japan stuff. That stuff doesn't register to me. That's not the Super Bowl, right? Those numbers don't jump off to me like somebody like Edge, who was in the mainstream for so long. And outside of WWE and AEW, who are the two bigs, and you could go back and I say WCW was a big. Outside of those, you have to be realistic. Those were the big leagues. Super Bowls matter, man. We judge quarterbacks and football players by Super Bowls. And who the fuck cares like what a Grey Cup is? Nobody knows who won the Canadian Football Championship. You know who won the Super Bowl. And WWE, and I'll throw AEW in there, those titles are the Super Bowl. And he just doesn't have the Super Bowl rings to step up to the Jerichos. And like, yeah, he's right there with Edge as far as I'm concerned. On pure talent, there may not be anybody better. But on this list, as far as this list goes, maybe Bryan's like he's right outside the door. He's knocking on the door. Like, he's got everything except the AEW championship to get past that VIP rope and get in to the God Club. So I'll lock it in. I'll lock it in right here. I think that's a solid list. The IWC, the internet, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, they can all start tearing me apart because that's what y'all fucking do. Y'all can tear apart this list, have at it, show me your list, show me where I'm wrong, show me where I'm right. These are my current gods of pro wrestling. The current gods that are still actively wrestling are Chris Jericho, Paul Heyman, and Charlotte Flair. That's just my perspective, right? Okay, so just for fun, before I end this video, I want to bring up, every time I do a Tiermaker list, I kind of throw together a rough draft before I actually do any research. And yes, I do a little bit of research in these videos. And the list I came up with is vastly different. The list I have Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns as gods of pro wrestling. I had Bryan Danielson as a god, which still, that's tough to not put him there. Jericho Titan, Kenny Omega Titan, Randy was right where I wanted him. I had Edge as a giant, but Edge's resume is so just misleading that like we don't remember everything Edge has done in his career, and I think he does get disrespected a little bit. And like I said, I'm gonna make the argument, right? Edge is top 20 of all time. And with that, that's my pro wrestling gods tier list. Please go to Tiermaker in the link of this video and fill out the exact same list and show me where I was right, show me where I was wrong, post it to Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Wherever you can post it. Tag me at Notorious Nerdy D. Make sure to like this video and leave a comment. Follow my channel, Casual Wrestling Show, on YouTube and podcasting networks for the greatest casual wrestling content on the internet. Casual wrestling content. I am Nerdy D, and that is my list.